Welcome to this event, and a special welcome to our speaker, Ben Wellings, who's going to be really fascinating, I know. And I don't know if you find this, but I find that when I get together with people, it's not very long before a name comes up, and that name is always Trump. They sometimes, the next person they talk about might be Nigel Farage. In England, they might start on about Marine Le Pen in France, George Meloni in Italy, the leaders of the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and possibly Pauline Hanson in Australia, but we don't hear so much about her these days. And sometimes people might talk about Peter Dutton in the same breath. And what we want to look at tonight is, who are all these people? What have they got in common? What do they and their parties stand for? And how worried should we be? And what should our response as being regarding ourselves in the progressive movement be to those people? And why is it that this phenomenon, which is sometimes called populism, and Ben, I know, is going to explain all about that, why isn't it happening very much on the left? Why aren't there left populists that are challenging? So to start off this discussion, Ben will be talking to us, then I'll have a bit of a chat with Ben, and then we'll open it up to the floor for discussion and question and answer and so on. So Ben is an associate professor in politics and international relations at Monash University. And he's an expert on the politics of nationalism, which is always tied up with these things, in the UK and contemporary Europe, and in the part played by national identity in political polarization, both inside countries and between different states, and is currently researching and focusing on nationalism and disintegration in the UK and the EU and the politics of the Anglosphere, which we are obviously a part. He comments regularly on national and international TV and radio, as well as contributing op-eds for major newspapers and online media. So welcome, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, members of Victorian Fabians, for the invitation and for having me here tonight. So Megan's going to assist me with the slideshow. So first of all, one of my briefs when I was speaking to Jeff in organising this particular event was to offer some definitions. And thank you, that's good help there. So the first to mention is of populism. So Jeff has mentioned this. So we're interested in the radical right and the far right. You know, there's been a lot of talk about these things with various elections, and of course the riots in England and Northern Ireland. These terms get used frequently and a lot. And so the first thing to do is maybe put some definitional clarity, or at least start to offer you some definitions of these phenomena and think about why there might be differences between them and where there may be overlaps. So the first thing is populism. So Jeff mentioned that, and I heard someone talk about the Greens. And I'm not sure the Greens are populist. And so let's think why. Populism, this is from someone who you may have read. If you read The Guardian about populism, you may have seen the name Cas Mudde, a Dutch academic who is currently in the United States, but this is where he was one of the first people to study populism in its 21st century guise. I think on the left there was populism in the 1970s. And as an ideology, you know, we go back to Russia in the 1880s for populism. But what do we mean by this? Obviously, it's about the people. And in some senses, you can go even as far back as ancient Rome, where politicians there used to mobilize this thing called the people, capital T, capital P, in order to advance their political gains. Now, in order to do that, it's populism is bound up with understandings of liberal democracy, and it's a way, if you like, of circumventing representative forms of democracy. Well, rather not exactly circumventing them, but actually seeking slightly different sources of support and advancing a slightly different critique. So if you think of an established political party, one of, say, two major parties, hang on, Megan, let's go back one. Let me go to the definition. So Monash says, populism is an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, right? Not classes, as it would be in a lot of left-wing ideologies, but these groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, okay? So in that, and it argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. So this is why we tend to associate populist politics with things like referendums and plebiscites, because these things, and we know that there are lots of problems with referendums and plebiscites, but they are supposed to have the effect of revealing what the people really think on a particular issue. We know they don't do that because it's very difficult to isolate one particular issue. But that's what populists are. And as Jeff said, we can talk about, Donald Trump is clearly in the populist mold. He's always talking about draining the swamp and offers a critique of certainly progressive elites, maybe less so other forms of money, power and influence, like Elon Musk. But definitely the message to the Make America Great Again crowd, the MAGA crowd, is always about corrupt elites and how they're trying to do over the American people. Thank you, Megan. If we move on to the next one, please. So we've got some definitions here. You've probably heard the term far right a lot recently. And if you read the right-wing press, they actually satirize this in some kind of funny ways, which sort of say, well, what does far right mean anymore? I mean, has this term been overused? If you eat meat, are you far right? If you don't drive an electric car, are you far right? So there is this kind of, it's kind of funny. You can do these quizzes to see if you're far right or not. But the point is, they are actually correct in that the term gets a little bit overused, but there are right times to use it. So when we associate figures with various forms, we can have the first one. When we think about the hard right, we tend to associate that, in Europe at least, because this was my brief, with Giorgia Meloni, who is head of a party called Fratelli d'Italia, and she is head of the Italian government at the moment. We can get to the percentages here, but won about between 27 and 30% of the votes in Italian and European elections. So next one. When we think about the radical right, and sometimes called, in the Hungarian sense, this is Viktor Orban, also called illiberal democracy, we start to get a notion of a right-wing critique, which is not conservative. Right? It doesn't seek to preserve anything, it actually seeks to overturn, and that's what makes it radical, but it is a right-wing critique, and it owes quite a lot to Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherism and so on. So the question is what kind of stance do progressives take towards the economic model, the critique of independent media, independent judiciary, which we see happens in Hungary, but also in Poland under the previous government. And also this the illiberalism, right? That is sort of seen to be a key feature of this kind of radical right critique, is that it's illiberal. Next one is Marine Le Pen. Could have put Jordan Bardella up there, but wanted to go with Le Pen because she's been leading that particular party. Used to be called the National Front, it's now called the National Rally. And the reason that you hear the term far right used in conjunction with her and her party, or movement, or rally in the French tradition, is that there was a court case where they said, she and other party members said, we don't like being called far right, and stop doing that. And the court said, no, you're a far right party. So that So that's stuff. And then lastly, we get to the extreme right. And this is someone called Tommy Robinson, or that's his nom de guerre, if you like. It's really Stephen Yaxley Lennon is his real name. And he's what we would call a member of the extreme right, formerly head of a kind of a movement called the English Defence League, and played a key role in spreading the misinformation that helped fuel the riots in England earlier this month. The thing to note about these people here, at least the three on your left, is that they all look very presentable. They're all got nice suits, very well dressed, and this is part of making the ideas that we would have associated with far-right parties more palatable to a wider audience. And so I think it's really quite important that when you think about these two, Giorgia Meloni and Marine Le Pen in particular, that they kind of appeal to women, right? So there is space for women to rise to the top of these parties, even if you're the daughter of the person that set it up. But she did kick her dad out 10 years ago from the party. So, and Giorgia Meloni has got a much more kind of working class narrative, in terms of her origins and how she rose to be the head of this party. The thing that is interesting about these two as well is, and this is what makes it difficult to sort of say, well, you could just say, well, Giorgia Meloni's kind of like Tony Abbott. She's just on that end of the right-wing spectrum. She's not really radical right, but it's the fact that the two of them have come from political parties or via political parties that used to have far-right connections. Thank you, Megan. We can move to the next one. So let's see how these radical right parties have done. So I'm going to talk first about the UK election and the French election. So the UK election, we're in. You probably get the sense. I'm sorry, the definition has blurred a little bit there in the projection, but you're probably following the news. You know that Labour won this massive majority, but not on a massive share of the vote, and that's to do with the voting system, right? But the thing to note is the party that came in third in that pale blue colour, Reform UK. So Reform UK is what we would classify a radical right party. It's not necessarily far right, but it does say, its leaders will say some things that far right parties do. We used to think that far-right parties had a very weak commitment to democracy, whereas Reform UK is a radical right populist party, needs the electoral system to be able to speak on behalf of the people. Okay, so that's one key difference. Another key difference is far-right parties were and are, along with extreme right movements, are openly racist. Whereas as we sort of start to get into the radical right populist and the hard right, there's more code words used for these kind of positions, and it does, it starts to impinge on things about which there could be more discussion about, such as immigration, right? But the immigration tends to be depoliticized somewhat by progressive parties. And they see no gain in talking about it. There's no political gain in talking about it because that's all the gain for these parties. So Reform did really quite well with 14% of the vote. Notice it only got 1% of the seats. So they're all about vote share rather than seats. Megan, so we can have the next slide, please. And here we're tracking Jean-Marie Le Pen, father, Marine Le Pen, daughter. And we're looking at how these votes have increased. And you might remember back in 2002, Jean-Marie Le Pen, another shock to the French system, became one of the two presidential candidates. There was a similar effect that we saw in the French system this time round, was that non-far right supporters rallied round the so-called Republican Front, and even left-wing supporters who didn't want to really vote for the centre-right candidate, Jacques Chirac, ended up doing that because they were just so repelled by the idea of the far right having a president. What we see in different elections, though, is that the support for the far right, or I should say, for Rassemblement National, has increased. And that's, I guess, the thing that perhaps we're interested in at this moment is like, what is it about their message that is really attractive to a significant minority of voters at this moment in historic time? Thanks, Lee. So here is where it starts to impinge on party politics. So we know that someone like Farage and Reform UK did very well in that election, 14% of the vote. Where are the votes coming from? For a start, they're coming from the Conservative Party. So that we know that the Conservative Party had its worst ever election ever since 1834, when we consider the Conservative Party to have begun. It's the second oldest party in the world after the Democrats. And so a result like July's is sort of very significant historically. So this then raises the question, well, where do the Conservative Party go in opposition? They've got to now reconstitute themselves. They've got to think, what are we trying to do? Do we try and win votes in the centre from the centrist Liberal Democrats in the UK system? Or do we try and win votes from the right? And so there's currently a leadership contest going on, and this is precisely the thing that's being debated. It leads also to Labour. So what I've just described here is what we would call inter-party competition, right? Because Reform UK has put up a challenge using and have been successful with radical right ideas, and the Conservative Party now needs to respond accordingly. So you might not think that's a worry for the Labour Party, especially with a huge majority. But the Labour Party's support is very wide and shallow. So it's you think that Reform are in second place in about 100 seats. So if there were, if there were election tomorrow again for whatever reason, we could see Reform do very, very well in terms of the number of seats that they could gain. A very rapid rise from 5 to anywhere like 100, conceivably. And this is where Labour, of course, then need to respond to that, and they tack a little bit to the right and start speaking the kind of language that seemingly appeals to sections of their voter base that are more working class and less educated, because the progressive vote tends to bifurcate between educated urbanites and kind of residual working class, less educated voters. And it's not always a happy constituency. Sorry, a sort of a happy alliance between these two things. And this message change, just to, before I get onto the final slide, is of course not just about inter-party competition. It's not just about changing government. It also says the Labour Party has changed. It's not Corbynite. So Corbyn's type of Labour from the left of the Labour Party, had some elements of populism in terms of the critique. So one of the critique of power and so on. So one of the things that the radical right do very well is that they kind of invert critiques. They always complain about elites. Sounds like left-wing critiques from the 1970s and 80s, right? And there's this sort of this idea of reverse Gramscianism that Gramsci was all about, like, let's capture the institutions that produce common sense, and now the right do that. The whole critique of, say, the BBC, the ABC, the so-called mainstream media is exactly that tactic. If you can't capture these institutions that reproduce progressive values, well, set up your own institution, set up your own media, Fox News, Twitter, X, so on and so forth. Megan, could we move on to the last slide here? So the question is, like, what about radical right populism in Australia? Jeff was suggesting in a discussion beforehand, do we have such a thing? And one answer is yes. We've mentioned Pauline Hanson. Probably most people can remember that particular episode in Australian political history, which in some senses was in advance of what we saw in Europe and US in the 2010s. but driven by kind of the same things, a reaction to globalization, with immigration as a touchstone issue. One of the differences now is that gender has become sort of a demarcator of progressive and reactionary politics, and of course, anti-Islam, rather than immigration solely, has become a focus of all these parties, and Hanson's no different to that. So we go to the next one, and that leads us then to our intra-party competition. So the Liberal Party is in opposition. After electoral defeats, parties tend to sort of like shift to what they think the true believers, really want. We see that, with Labour parties. We see that with Conservative parties. So the Liberal Party is going through one of those moments as well. But of course, the voting system in Australia, it's always said, makes people tend more towards the centre, because there's a bunch of people who have to vote who aren't necessarily engaged, and you tend not to. You have to talk to the centre rather than the extremes. I wonder how that will hold, because another political strategy is just to sort of mobilise, a base, pick up issues and run with them that you think are going to generate controversy. And so we've seen that play out in Parliament, in Australian Parliament this week, in terms of the Gazan refugees and the status of Gazan refugees. One important thing about populism is that it's often seen as a style or tone of politics. There's not necessarily any goal other than to generate certain controversies that then may or may not translate into votes, but they have the effect of shifting what we call the Overton window, that is like the window of what is acceptable to say. And you can probably get some examples, things that are acceptable to say now that weren't 20 or 30 years ago, and you can get a sense of what's shifted in one direction or another, which leads us to the final one here, which is, of course, well, what does the Labour Party do about that? And if we're talking about the progressive movement more broadly, what do the Greens do about that? And the Labour Party, I think, is in a particular. The Greens can keep cleaving to their values quite closely, I think, because a minor party's position is to either influence another party or form a coalition. And then they can do that in the Senate, they can do that, in the representatives, depending on how these votes land. The Labour Party is one of the sort of two dominant parties in Australian politics. Is a slightly different problem, because it needs to think, where does it pitch its message? Does it start to make moves or start speaking as if it's addressing issues that the radical right or the right have generated? So maybe cutting student numbers as a way of looking like there's some sort of control over immigration, or does it shift more to the centre and try and capture that centre ground? Does it speak to its working class, its original working class support, thinking about the trajectory and the change that the Labour Party has been through, or does it seek to speak more to the urban young in particular, who tends to vote Green, right? So they're the question. That's the kind of scene setter. I think I'll probably leave it at there, and then we might move, Jeff, if you want to our next part.
So we're going to have a little discussion, and then we'll have a broader discussion. Can you see us and hear us okay if we're sitting down, or is it better if we stand up? No. Yeah. Okay, so can I just throw a couple of thoughts into this? So starting off with populism, which we've seen and Ben's described it as a sort of movement of the people versus the elite. That's kind of, I think, what it's about. And there are a couple of things about that. One is, of course, the populists that we've looked at are carrying out their battle through the electoral system. So they haven't said, no, the electoral system doesn't work, we stand for election and so on and so forth. But what they do say is that we we are not part of this elite. So that I would say, and I need to Ben's comment, that traditional parties are seen as different bits of one elite. So, you know, they're established and so on, they're sort of respected in the press and so on. And so, for example, if you take Trump in America, he's against the Democrats, but he's against the traditional Republicans as well. If you look at Corbyn in Britain, obviously he's against the Tories, but he was also against aspects of the Labour Party, which he thought was undemocratic and so on. And I think the question we have to ask is, this distrust of the elite, where does it come from? You know, is it to some extent justified? And is it a justifiable point that these traditional parties are actually bipartisan parts of that elite to quite an extent, and are not challenging it? And you know, the sorts of things that the whatever you call them, radical right, whatever, will challenge is the military-industrial complex, and the way that it has driven particularly America and its allies into wars, so many wars. They will challenge Big Pharma, and they will say that the way that, for example, the COVID epidemic was dealt with was prioritize the profits of Big Pharma, for example. And also that the kind of neoliberal thing that was introduced as a somewhat revolutionary thing by Thatcher, Reagan, even though they were on the right, pretty much everyone's bought into that. We're not really challenging that sort of market model. Whereas in fact, you know, if you look at, sorry, I'll stop soon and let Ben respond. But if you look at, for instance, the Trump camp in the USA, they're somewhat anti-market. You know, they want to introduce protectionism and that sort of thing. So the question is, we have to look at, I think, the elites that we have, the bipartisan support that they have, and ask, does that elite, is it justifiably losing the trust of people? And that's what the right is dealing with, and why isn't the left? Sorry.
Well, that's good. And I just want to make sure, do I need to sit a little bit closer to be on the camera? Yeah.
It's okay, that's
All right. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. There's a lot there. So first thing is that, of course, populist politicians claim to speak on behalf of the people. So we don't necessarily know that they do represent the people, but they make that claim. But I think that how you describe the two parties moving together is really important in this. And of course, that has been happening in liberal democracies since the 80s and 90s. So we've got this kind of convergence over economics in particular, where it's a little bit different now, but you know, like for a while now, it was not easy to tell the difference on economic policies, and governance was supposed to be about, well, everyone knows that crime's wrong, and you need like good education and healthcare and so on, and it's just who's the more competent management, you know, like, so there used to be this time in the 2000s when politics was really boring, and you know, it was just kind of about that. The material critique that eventually grew up is very much, it predates, but it was accelerated by the financial crisis, where in the US it was about the subprime market. In Europe, it was about the Eurozone, the adoption of austerity as a response to the Eurozone crisis. And this allowed people to say, well, you know, why are we being punished for the misdeeds of others? The others being bankers, and opprobrium kind of landed more on politicians than it did on bankers, because politicians are accountable ultimately in a way that the financial elites are not. Nonetheless, it enabled political entrepreneurs like Nigel Farage and others on the radical right to sort of say, well, neither of these parties suit you. So you're absolutely right to say that, you know, and in the kind of pure two-party system that they have in the US, there's no way, it's, you know, you can't like go off and like vote for another party. You have to kind of like fight over the meaning of either the Republicans or the Democrats, and then capture that, and that's what's happened with the MAGA have overtaken the Republican Party. So and then that critique is I think valid, and you know one sort of, you know, what can progressive politics do is just simply make people's lives better, and there has to be kind of like ways of, in a material sense, making people's lives more secure. So working conditions really matter. The type of employment you have, the type of pensions you can expect, you know, it's really leading longer lives, and a lot of support actually comes from older people for radical right parties, and I think that's to do with the kind of insecurities that people who are at the lower end of the socio-economic scale experience in the day-to-day sense.
Yeah. So just a couple of more points I'd like to make, and we'll open it up. I just want to mention immigration, because it's a big thing, obviously, for Farage in Britain, for Trump in the USA, well, for all European parties as well, for Orban in Hungary, because Orban doesn't allow immigration. And the thing is that in Australia, and I think one of the reasons why, in my opinion, we can come to it, we don't really have this sort of far radical right in Australia, is we don't have an immigration problem. The policies, the immigration, the bipartisan immigration policies in Australia would be the dream of Trump or Farage or whatever. So we probably don't need to talk too much about immigration. Obviously, there are issues around asylum and that sort of thing. But it seems to me that the mainstream parties in Europe, Britain, the USA, have to address it, and it can be addressed in a non-racist way. It can be addressed in and again, that's, to my mind, is this sort of thing about the radical right versus the far right. The far right are racist. So Tommy Robinson is a racist, but it's perfectly possible to discuss immigration in a rational way that's not racist. But I wasn't so much wanting to get into that now, because I don't think it's an issue for Australia, but people might. But just a couple of things I wanted to just throw in. People in Australia, I think, and people in this room, are very exercised about this problem. You know, Trump, you know, Farage, all these people. I wonder what we actually have to fear from them. You know, if Trump, you know, wins, if they win government, a lot of them aren't. I mean, Farage is just an opposition. You know, what do we fear from them? Do we need to fear them? Are they going to do anything that's going to damage us? I'm not sure they are, really. You know, if Trump has said that he'll end wars, Trump has said he doesn't want a war with China. If they sort out their immigration policy, they might do it well in a humane or inhumane way. What does it matter to us? I wonder if we get too worried about it.
All right, so I'm going to deal with the immigration thing first. I think it'd be well worth rehearsing some arguments about the values and benefits and costs of immigration, because whilst you're right that immigration has been depoliticised in Australia, all the attention goes to asylum seekers, and in some senses that has served as a distraction, whilst a very uncontroversial and in comparative terms successful migration policies has existed, even under Howard. So at the height of the Tampa, you know, there were still like very large numbers of people coming from China and India, as well as the UK and New Zealand and the Philippines and Vietnam, the top 6 destination countries, which was largely controversial and didn't attract the kind of attention that immigration has in those other Europe and the US that was mentioned there. That doesn't mean to say people on the right are not going to try and make hay with that, and I think that's precisely what the tactic was over the Gazan raising that in Parliament, is to find an issue that can kind of stoke those kind of divisions and start to eat away at them, right? And eat away at the cohesion, or what do I want to say, the bipartisan approach to immigration. Now, the Liberal Party is currently very much wedded to that global model of neoliberalism that needs lots of cheap migrant labour. But nonetheless, I think it would be well worth progressive. I think progressives ignore that issue at their peril, because it's much easier terrain for the radical right to speak about, and I think that when they see their moment, they will seize it. When Jeff, when you say what do we have to worry, do you mean we in Australia?
Yes.
I think so. I remember being worried when Trump got in the first time that this would be someone who's very unstable on foreign policy. And I think in some senses, when you remember the whole stuff about North Korea, that was true. But at the same time, there was no strategy behind North Korea at all. And it was just this sort of performative element of populism, which is like, this is the way things have been done before. Let's upset that a bit. We'll upset some elites in Washington and other parts of the world, so what? And I think the thing that perhaps I'd underestimated would be the isolationism of the first Trump presidency, and really how much an America, the so-called America First element of this really mattered to Trump. I mean, there is this kind of America is big enough and powerful enough to like concentrate only on itself, and that's plenty to be getting on with. What does it mean for us? Well, if you want to believe them about China, I guess you can. I don't know that I do. And I think the America First initiative is also a bit of a risk to AUKUS. Now, whether getting into AUKUS was the right thing to do is one question. We're in it now. And the biggest threat to any submarines arriving in time is going to come from the Trump presidency, which if they don't arrive, then we've kind of got a bit of a gap in our defences. So having then pointed this alliance at China to then like have no actual, well, very diminished submarine capacity till 2040 probably leads to strategic abandonment. Anyway, that's what I'll say about that.
Okay, and thanks very much, Ben. And this is my last question, then we'll throw it over. I've said a couple of times, I don't think we've got the equivalent of, Farage and Le Pen and Trump and so on in Australia. I think we've still got a kind of a democracy with two parties who are both part of what I would call the elite. I think the LP's part of the elite, along with the Libs. They're different parts of the Australian elite that they compete for power, and they're not really being challenged, I don't think, by, let's say, by populists. And I'd just be interested in Ben's view and other people's view on that. And if that's true, why? And I'd just like to offer some thoughts on that. One is that, well, I think we do have very robust institutions, exceptionally robust democratic institutions in Australia, very good social cohesion, partly probably because of our immigration policy. We're far from what I would call the imperial centre. I think the sort of imperial activities of America and its allies are really crucial in all this. And we're a long way away from it. And we are able to somewhat stand aside from it. And I think our government is doing a very good job of that, not getting drawn in to Ukraine conflict, not getting drawn in to, having, I think, quite a good line on Gaza. We had a discussion about that last time. And also our Labour Party with people like Penny Wong are doing a good job, I think, of keeping relationships with China. So I think that for a number of reasons, we don't have that here. And we may escape it because it's all the Australia being the lucky country, other countries make the mistakes for us, you know, and when they've all sorted it out in the USA and Europe and so on, then we'll be able to sort of quietly just go along. So I'm just wondering what you think about
yeah, that's really interesting, Jeff. I think that I mean, we did have our radical right populist moment with Hansonism in the late 90s. And you know, there was like a sort of a presage of what happened in Europe and the US later on, as I mentioned. We also have part of the United Party. And so I think that there are particular areas where it might be possible for radical right parties to emerge. And so we do, you know, we still have one nation in the Senate. It's more a case, I think, of whether the Liberal Party tries to capture that vote. So for sure there are going to be people beyond central Melbourne, you know, in Australia, and I don't want to point to any other states, but you know, particularly Queensland and West Australia, where the Voice, you know, referendum did worse. You know, where those sentiments are out there. I do think that although, you know, overall GDP figures are not good, you know, Australia is not experiencing as sharp pressures as other countries are in terms, and sustained as well. So, you know, when the US and Europe were going into their austerity and their crises, the mining boom was kind of keeping the overall coffers full. Doesn't mean to say that people aren't going to experience economic hardship and so on, but you know, overall that was pretty good. And we do have robust institutions. At the same time, the same pattern is emerging that fewer people are voting for the major parties. So in the compulsory vote system, you know, like where does it go? So in the UK, 4.7 million people just didn't vote, right? So that tells you something about the lack of faith in politics to change things. And I think that's probably what we do have in Australia, is a sense that representative politics is not the vehicle for change that maybe at the end of the Second World War, people invested a lot of hopes. And it was effective, it did change a lot. And the question is, you know, what could it change now? Climate crisis is the big one. That would kind of split the vote, and then the Labour Party would have to sort of wonder, well, if we adopt green policies, are we going to upset people in Queensland? Basically, yeah. But so yes, that's my response to that. Thank you.
Thanks. And of course, illustrating the point, they know sort of cut and dry, all these answers, all these things, you know, fray at the edges and so on. It's a complex world. So well, I've had my go anyway. Ben's still in the hot chair.
Shall I stand up for this?
Yeah, why not? So let's just a few questions, comments from the audience. Can I just say you're very welcome to comment and to question, but please keep it short, and I might quite ruthlessly cut people short if needed. So
yeah, question. You know, shouldn't we have been worried about the movement of Hitler in the 1930s? How did that translate for us after that? Trump, I think, and I believe, and I'm going to say that I've done, is that he looks like a 21st century Adolf Hitler, and he's espousing the same kind of dialogue. He's suggesting the same kind of things in a very similar way about purification or putrefaction of race and so on. I think we can be adversely affected by if he gets in and what happens and the change of that. You know, I believe that he's trying to take the United States to a dictatorship from a democracy, and he is very much hell-bent on that, like Mussolini did in the 1930s, really.
That's really good to get, because the fears are historical ones, aren't they? They're drawn on the experience of fascism and Nazism in Europe. And that rightly makes us very nervous. I suppose, what are the differences without downplaying the threat? Hitler and Mussolini were, and the Nazis and the fascists were openly anti-democratic. Now, I suppose you could kind of say that about Trump with the insurgency and the attempt to capture institutions. But I think the thing is that they need to capture institutions rather than, and they need the democratic veneer to be the will of the people. So that's why it was very. So on one hand, it's very important for Trump to have that democratic legitimacy, which is why he's such a bad loser. He never likes to concede anything in a vote, right? And not least the 2020 election. But at the same time, you've got to worry, haven't you, about someone who can lead a mob against his own vice president to take on that. And the other thing, of course, is that there are militias in the US. There are militias in Australia, but not as well organised and as prolific as in the US. So the theory is always a historical one, I guess, to use this.
Another question? I just said, yeah, I go that. Yeah.
I have a question. What do you think about the Wellings style thing? So where Labour can reach like 20% of the vote, the extremists, one of the most seats, mostly going through Greens. Do you think that those losses will continue in the future?
Yes.
Question just be repeated.
All right, sorry. So the question was about Labour's declining vote share, in particular in sort of outer urban areas, Walthamstow, and how they might be losing to the Greens.
Not just Walthamstow, I also mean more in areas like the same London East or Man.
Yeah. So it's all. Can I interpret that to sort of say, so it's about Labour losing out in inner urban cities,
Yeah,
and they're losing out to young people who are attracted to some extent to the Greens, although the Greens do not get quite the same level of votes in the UK as they do in Australia. So on about 5% overall in the UK and about 10% overall in Australia. So is it, you want me to say, like,
what do you think will happen next? Do you think they're going to get thrown in Britain the same in Australia?
They suffer a bit from the first past the post voting system, where it's very difficult to break through. So we've talked about Reform getting 1% of the seat on 14% of the votes. The Greens did a little bit better. Where the Greens did well is that they got someone who was going to be a cabinet minister out of their seat. And that means that the Labour government needs to be a little bit mindful of that pressure from the potentially Green voting section. But it's not quite the threat to the British Labour Party it is to the Australian Labour Party because of the voting system.
Janet?
Thanks very much, Ben. I was wondering whether we should also be looking at the deep social changes that have been going on. The wonderful economic historian Darwin Asomoglu, I always get his name wrong, but the Turkish American, argues that liberal democracies have absolutely failed the working class in the last 30 years. And what we're seeing is this increasing inequality, and that the great division is between those who have got tertiary education and those who haven't. And now we've got the situation, which is what the Greens mop up, is young tertiary educated people who themselves feel excluded from secure jobs, good careers and housing. So we've got all these pressures, but I was thinking, going back to, if we start with France as the beginning of this, it's that 1 million Pieds-Noirs who arrived in France in 1962. People who were poor French, who were looked down on by metropolitan French people as being common and not very French, and despised by the left for being racist, which they were. I should say my mother was a Pieds-Noir, so a little bit about it. That they remain as a sort of lump of resentment in the gorge of the La France ever since. That they were always excluded. Now I saw films recently in the French election of Le Pen's big supporters, and it looked like a group from the southern states of America of poor whites. They're very much poor whites. Hillary would have called them deplorables. Now, what we've got as a world now, where a large number of people are excluded, deindustrialised people from the United Kingdom, we've got deindustrialised people from France, deindustrialised people or East Germans from in Germany, and in Australia it's Queensland and also Western South Australia. Places where in fact the economic trajectory of people is very different from the southeastern states. And in the southeastern states, our working class is largely migrant. So they're more resistant. However, Peter Dutton's got them in his sights, and he will be running an anti-immigrant campaign, which is very much picking on Indians. Now, Indians have a hard time in Melbourne. You may not realise it when we live around here, but out in the western suburbs they do. The Chinese had a very bad time in the pandemic. And what we've got is these big forces of change in society where we've got people who are left out and going finally to America, that wonderful book about strangers in their own land.
What's the question?
Well, I'm making a comment. I think there's an element of the analysis you haven't put in, because it's not just politics, it's the big, deep social economic things changing.
Janet, I think you're saying
So the question is, could you comment on that element?
So the socio-economic is really, really important, and like the kind of jobs people have or don't have. So it's not really about unemployment, which kind of drove the last time we went through kind of a rise in support for the far right was the 70s, when we had that stagflation. But now it's about like kind of having part-time jobs and temporary jobs that you can't live on, don't provide a living wage. And that is something that the post-war compact has broken down. Now the post-war idea was that well, it goes back a bit further in Australia history, but the idea that and of course this is deeply sexist, but a man could provide a living wage for his family, and that provided a level of security, and that has broken down and was sort of too expensive, and the welfare state has grown, and we get what we call welfare chauvinism, where the contest is over what kind of provision there are for non-nationals in terms of welfare housing and so on. And so housing is another element. I mean, you mentioned the Greens, but another tactic of the right has been to link immigration and housing, which has never, to my knowledge, been quite the issue in Australia that it has been in, say, the United Kingdom, where it's like quite closely related as an issue that drives support for the far right and the radical right. And so that changing socioeconomic base also starts to explain why fewer and fewer people vote for the two main parties, because they are seen as increasingly as part of the problem rather than the solution.
Thanks. Just before I take the next question, so just to clarify, we're very interested in people's comments. I find what Janet says always extremely interesting and to the point. But also we need to be aware of limiting the time, so we allow plenty of people to speak. So, gentlemen over there.
Ben, I'm very interested in international alliances and diplomacy, and more importantly, your views on it. So my question is simple. It's how might Australia's diplomatic strategies need to adapt to a more ideologically divided Europe and the UK?
I suppose they already have. The Australian government, through its diplomatic corps, will have to work with whoever is in government, and I suppose at the moment that's Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban. Hungary is of course landlocked country in the middle of Europe, and although it's seen as kind of an interesting experiment as far as the right are concerned, its impact on Australia is going to be limited. That's less true for Italy, of course, which has strong people-to-people links. Is one of the G7 members, and under Meloni has a kind of perhaps some very sort of pro. She's unusual, we should say, in terms of the kind of hard conservatives, unlike Le Pen, she's very pro-NATO, very pro-Ukraine. And I think it's in that sense, her foreign policy for the Italian government has aligned, with Australia. We are involved in Ukraine, of course, we've given lots of ammunition and money and some Bushranger, armored fighting vehicles. But so I think that is one element of this. But in terms of the United Kingdom, I think, and this is maybe a point, is that there was a lot of instability under the Conservative government in the United Kingdom, and some of that aligned with the Liberal Party's views on the world, and some of it less so. So they were very Liberal Party were kind of sceptical of Sunak in the way that the right was in general. It was very interesting when I was going on TV on Sky. I shouldn't say, but anyway. But there was this general sense that Sunak was not a proper Conservative, and that he, by giving away lots of money during the COVID pandemic, that had betrayed conservatism, and the taxes have gone up under him, and that's been. So I think that outside of things like AUKUS and the Quad, and there are these organisations and that exist to kind of like balance and manage regional tensions. But in terms of an ideologically divided US, well, we've kind of got that already. I mean, I think maybe your question is what will Australia do if Trump wins?
It was more to do with, you can see the link between the UK with Labor and the Australian Labor.
Oh, yes,
more of a
yeah.
linkage there. But when you've got Europe, which is so much disparity between different countries there, how do we how does our diplomatic strategies adapt to that sort of change between the different countries we can do?
Just on the, I think on the bilateral relationships, rather than thank you very much. Rather than well, if it was refracted through the European Union, then the European Commission comes into play. But in terms of if say a difference between a social democrat government in Germany and the Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, it would be on the bilateral front. So yeah, bit by bit, I think is the short answer.
I'm sorry, sure. I want to return to the question. Sorry, okay. I want to return to the question of what difference does it make if the dictatorial leaders win, and particularly I'm thinking of as a collective.
Yeah.
You spoke briefly about the Overton window and shifting what seems to be possible. I think at the base of that is a question of accountability. In Australia, we're lucky, I think, that we have a parliamentary system which at least slows down, it doesn't entirely prevent, executive power, the concentration of power in the top of government. Yes, I know, Scott Morrison had a very good go at concentrating that power, but the fact that ultimately political parties are responsible to a parliament, which is effectively the whole of the representation of the electorate, it's quite different from the personal power that is vested in despotic kind of people. And I think the primary example would be, I mean, presidential systems tend to sort of head that way anyway, but the court case that decided that Trump had all of those extra powers, where he himself, because he was, whatever he is in chief and, absolutely everything else, it's a very despotic position to be in the President of the United States, more so because of that. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on the relative accountabilities and to what extent that impacts on people's idea of what democracy is, because democracy under those systems, it might help prop up a picture of popularity, but it tends to get reduced to voting only with no other intercession.
Thank you. Great question. And I think there are three things that I probably want to talk about that. Of course, my first answer to Jeff's provocation is, what does it matter? Well, was in a sort of strict international relations sense. But in terms of values, if democracy, like the question behind you, was to go under in the United States, that would be of grave concern to us here and everyone in the world, because it is the best system yet devised. And the presidential systems that you mean, that concentration of power, of course, there are checks and balances in the, but it depends with the, to what extent there might be armed support for Trump. And another presidential system and another populist we haven't mentioned yet, of course, is Emmanuel Macron. So Macron was also a populist, but one from the centre. I mean, he also said that these two main political parties are not serving anymore, and he very effectively destroyed the centre-left and centre-right parties in France. So he's also seen as, the party was initially about him. It was, Emmanuel Macron's En Marche. The initials are the same, and it has shifted a little bit, but yeah, he's there. So. I guess what that means is that the type of democratic system matters, and we do have one which can be frustrating in terms of like trying to change things, but it is I think robust. I think there is that it is healthy. I do wonder what the future of the two-party system might be. Yeah, and I guess that kind of change, we don't know what sort of unintended consequences there may be from that.
Thanks, Ben. We've got time for one or two more questions, so it's very difficult for me. But okay, you've got people lobbying for you, so
it must be a really good question.
You must be a
I was thinking about a much broader palette here, and what prompted me to think about that, and I'm sure I'm not unique in the room, is the comment about what do we have to fear from someone like Trump getting into power, and maybe we don't have to fear very much. Well, I started to think, I got really alarmed at that, because I wonder, what about the planet? The right-wing groups and what Trump represents in terms of drill baby drill, quote unquote, that got a very small mention in anything that's been discussed so far, and I just felt mobilised to say it. And interested to hear your comment about the effect of the right on the long-term well-being of the planet. That's not an easy question, but there you are.
Well, they certainly seem to have been more openly captured by carbon interests, and that's sort of been documented, by journalists throughout the life of the previous coalition government in Australia. Again, climate, so the populists often put themselves against technocrats, and so the technocrats are the economists and the scientists who say we can prove to you with evidence that the world is heating up, that's going to have these negative consequences through our projections, and the populists reject that because it's seen that the cost of mitigating this is going to fall disproportionately on those at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and that's again a key element of support for the right. Not that centre-left governments are immune from this either. The UK government has been rolling back a lot of its pledges on green transition, partly because they were just frightened of the right-wing press, I think, in the United Kingdom, getting into them, and of course Labour governments in the UK and Australia are sort of being burnt by experience, and they fear collapsing their support. And it is true that there is in the UK this idea of the shy Tory. So leading into the election, to give this example, there's 20% opinion poll for 2 years. That's absolutely rock solid. People say, I'm going to vote Labour, I'm not voting for Conservative. And then when you get to the actual way people vote, it's a 10% gap. So like at least half the people are just saying that, right? But they're saying it for 2 years to the same people, right? So I think that in terms of the climate, then this is another kind of progressive cause, but in the electoral politics over there is, and it goes back to the question about Walthamstow, is how do you bring those two disparate groups together, which are actually pulling further apart. So what is it that progressives can do to bring that into an electoral coalition?
Right, it's going to be the last question now, and I'm going to give it to Jack or Halliday for that.
Look, I think there seems to be a lot of extolling of the virtues of democracy going on, especially in the US at the moment. Kamala Harris's position and claims it should be restored democracy. If you look at Pew surveys for the last few years, support for the major parties is consistently declining, and that process is going to continue. Where does it lead to? I mean, it must lead, that space must be taken by some organisations, some that's the word I'm trying to find, some significant constellation of forces. So following what Janet was saying earlier, the question is, how do parties like the Labor Party re-establish themselves as having some value and meaning for the people they've lost? And where do they need to be going to restore that kind of confidence?
Thank you. I think that goes back to the I think that the Australian Labor Party is again, and this is the difficult part, is responding to people's material concerns that they are suffering, and whatever, you know, we say, you know, the view from space is that Australia looks good, but if people are struggling to put food on the table, they don't feel that, right? So that's one thing, but they've also got to keep in mind the climate crisis, the Green Party, and so on. And I'll come back to that. How do they reconcile those two in electoral terms? You know, because the Green Party are not going to really want to just surrender all their voters to the Labour Party just as sort of part of the greater good, in order to sort of fend off. I mean, they could do that. They could decide, well, let's just sort of capture the Labour Party and make it into a, you know, but the Labour Party then probably going to lose its votes in certain key areas. Then it will struggle to form government, you know, which may happen in the next election. You know, if you're not in power, you're not going to be able to make those reforms. So, what if there is in 2025 a hung parliament and we get a red-green coalition? Well, we've sort of been down that road before, and it didn't end super well. But of course, people learn from things, don't they? And so maybe the crisis is worse, and people are more galvanised. But I think that the progressives have got to address the socio-economic question that was being, you know, pointed out. They've got to address the decline in status. So it's not just a material thing, it's about the decline of status of certain communities, and that gap between the tertiary educated and the non-tertiary educated over certain issues, not least climate. We could mention Gaza and gender as well. We wanted to really open up there. I know we're not finished, but so I think there's a multi-pronged approach, which is of course easy to say. When you're confronted with the electoral and political realities, it becomes harder. Where do you make the compromises? Where do you cut? So on that note of difficulty, maybe I should stop.
Thank you very much, Ben, and I think that's a very good conclusion to come to. There are no easy answers.